that's what we're going to look at today. So you should be able to identify examples of evidence for evolution from each of the 5 disciplines. So you want to know what those 5 disciplines are, obviously. And then we want to differentiate between homologous, analogous, and vestigial species or structure, sorry. Do you remember any of those words from biology? Vestigial, analogous, or homologous?
Isn't vestigial like a fake wing or something? Like it's not actually a wing, just like a old version of a wing.
Old version, yeah. So it's like a diminished due to disuse over time. So like the kiwis have the itty bitty wings that can't fly. So that would be a vestigial species, or I don't know why I'm saying that, a vestigial structure. What about analogous or homologous? Can you guys differentiate between those two? Which one would mean they have the same structure? One of them is same structure, the other one is same function. Which is the same structure? Chat box.
Homologous.
Homologous is similar structure between species. Yep, that's right. And then I think I will put my controls over on that. Look at me doing stuff in here. Okay, and then analogous would be similar function, but different structures. All right, so the 5 disciplines that we're speaking of when we say 5 disciplines of support, we have the fossil record, embryology, and we kind of talked a little bit about the fossil record already. Embryology, anatomical structures, and that's where you get into your homologous, analogous, or vestigial species. Biogeography, should think of land, right? And biochemical. So this is our big proteins, amino acid sequences, DNA sequences. So we also have some direct observation through evolutionary change. What have we seen in our lifetime, right? We have seen bacteria evolve to be resistant to antibiotics, which is what we started our Kahoot with. Viruses, we're seeing COVID evolve in the past year. It has many variants now, right? And insects evolve as well to be resistant to pesticides. So we have to keep changing the chemicals that we try to use. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail and talk about those examples. Fossil record, it's important to recognize that only the hard body parts are what is left behind. So those soft body parts may have clues to relationship, but we don't have those soft body parts typically. Shells and bones are usually what are left behind. You might also have imprints or molds or casts. Fossils show changes that have occurred over time, and we've seen that. So we can see in the fossil record a gradual change in an organism's features. We can also see punctuated change, quick change, right? That's usually due to like a natural disaster of some sort. So the sedimentary rock layer, we talked about that in the last lecture, and how the further down the rock layers the fossil is found, the older the fossil would be, right? We can also use carbon dating to date a fossil due to the half-life of carbon, and all living organisms are made up of carbon. So they can calculate the half-life of the different fossils and kind of predict a date that that fossil would have been there. Other than that, this is like a relative. The further down they are, the older they are. So we've seen the fossil change over time. There's transition fossils that show how one species may have evolved into another species. And in some cases that transition fossil is missing. And we have found transition fossils even in the last 20 years that now answer questions that we had before. So here's probably the most common example, and I would definitely be familiar with Archaeopteryx. The most common transition, or the most like famous transition fossil we have, is the Archaeopteryx, which is supposed to be a connection between the dinosaurs and the birds. So it lived about 150 million years ago. Another example, this is the one I said that was found in just the last 20 years, the Tiktaalik rosé. This I think they talk about the Tiktaalik in the first page of chapter, whatever we're on. Are we on 15? Yeah. So it talked about that being kind of explaining how the fish may have made their way out of the water. So it's a tetrapod, meaning 4 feet, but it was actually like a fish ish, right? But he had broad wrists for walking. And so he lived in the shallow swampy areas. And so it could swim and it could walk. So this is supposed to be the transition between those two. This is kind of the evolution of whales, showing how the whales have perhaps over time given rise to the hippos. And we know hippos like the water as well, right? So whales descended from an ancestor that had 4 legs and walked on land. Isn't that interesting? Like it came off land and went into the waters. So 1993, we found the Ambulocetus natans right here, the walking whale that swims. So this showed similar features to the land animal, and here it is right here. Similar species features to the land animals and similar features as the water dwellers. And so that's the transition between the two of those. You wouldn't have to know those examples. I would be familiar with Archaeopteryx because it's pretty famous, but other than that, if they're going to use an example, they're going to talk about it in the question prompt. And so you're just taking the knowledge you have about transition fossils and that they're the connection between two, and you're applying that to whatever that particular situation is. Biogeography talks about where the organisms are found, so the distribution of species. We were talking about the different organisms in South America or that aren't found in Australia, and species that are found in Australia that aren't found elsewhere. So that would go under the biogeography. So we find rabbits in North America, but we don't find them in South America. Isn't that interesting? There is a similar species in South America, and that is the Patagonia cavy, but a different species. So the idea is that after the lands separated, because remember Patagonia, we were all one big land mass. After the organisms moved from one area to another area, then evolution took place because they were in new environmental stresses, right? So those adaptations that allowed them to be well suited for that area allowed them to survive, pass on their traits, and the rabbit-ish trait would have disappeared. To tell you the truth, I don't know which came first, the Patagonia cavy or the rabbit, but one of them disappeared in that other area. They're both here now. Marsupials are found mainly in Australia. So again, Australia and South America were once connected. Placental mammals outcompeted the marsupials in South America. So the marsupials died off in that area, but were well suited for Australia. And so they would have survived in Australia. So the numbers declined over time in South America. The variability, we learned that variability is one of the 4 key principles for evolution to occur, correct? Natural selection to occur. There has to be a variation in species in order for one to have an advantage over another. So variability can lead to adaptation. Remember that adaptation isn't like instantaneous. It is mutations that have accumulated over several generations. And adaptation is referring to a feature that is advantageous. Competition for resources provides the selective pressure that leads to diversity. That was one of our other 4 principles, right? So that moves us into the anatomical evidence where we talk about homologous structures. So we are all related, and we know this because we have similar structures, right? And I think a key when you're doing evolution questions, if you can recognize the more similar 2 things are, the more closely related they are. That's like an underlying theme that you can take through most of your evolution questions. The more dissimilar they are, the less related they are. They share a more past common ancestor. If they're very similar, they share a recent common ancestor. So this is showing that these organisms have similar features and therefore must have a similar ancestor, right? Gave rise to each of these. So homologous structures may look different, but underneath they are the same. So we all have the radius the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges, making up the forearm, the wrist, and the hand. So this shows a common ancestor. We can also look at what causes us to have similar features, right? Our DNA codes for our traits. So if we have similar features, our DNA is most likely similar as well. And if our DNA is similar, we got it from the same source. So you can trace that back. So these have the same structure, but different functions, right? The whale uses it to swim, the bird uses it to fly, the dog uses it to walk, and the human uses it to manipulate the mouse on their computer. Here's some more examples. So notice these all have the same structure. So they all have similar ancestors. So all vertebrates, those organisms with a backbone, have that similar forelimb feature or the bone arrangement. We might use them for different purposes. So this is going back into that DNA came from a common ancestor and the DNA codes for your traits. Modified independently based on the path that that organism, like environmental stresses that that organism would have. And so organisms with the same sort of environmental stresses, like these are all flying organisms, right? So they would have evolved to have similar features. The embryonic development, the fact that at the embryo stage, related organisms have similar features. So the fish, the reptile, the bird, the human, we all have gill slits in the embryonic stage. They develop into different structures in the adult form, like our lungs. We all have the tail when we are in the embryonic stage as well. So we can see that the more closely related organisms are, the more similar their embryonic stages are. So they might not be apparent in the adult form, but they are apparent in the embryonic stage. The post-anal tail, the pharyngeal pouches, and again, it's your genes that code for your traits, right? And we talked about the homeobox. We talked about the axis, like posterior, anterior. There's genes that determine what's going to be the head, the thorax, and the caudal region. So the same genes are coding for these traits. And if you have the same genes, you must be coming from the same ancestor. So this is the homeobox I talked about, and we just mentioned it briefly before. This is showing you, these are all different genes, but you can see like the common genes recognizing the forefront. The caudal refers to tail, cranial refers to head, the thorax, the abdominal region, the pelvic region. Okay, so the same genes are being expressed to determine that axis. Therefore, we must have a common ancestor because these genes are common between us. The more of those genes that are the same, the more closely related two organisms would be. Vestigial structure, Corbin told us a little bit about the vestigial structure. They've been reduced over time, often referred to as disuse. So the fact that the structure remains shows us that the DNA for that structure exists, and therefore that individual got that DNA from a common ancestor with some other organism that actually has that feature, right? So this is a snake, and you can see in its ancestral fossil the hind leg, and here we can see the nubbins left behind that were once that hind leg. So we can see these two organisms must be related, and that this is now a vestigial structure that has decreased in size because it was no longer used. It was no longer needed. We have our tailbone, perhaps once was a tail, right? Our appendix is another example. Our wisdom teeth, another example. These are structures that we don't necessarily need, and they've become smaller and smaller over time. The kiwi is the one that Corbin mentioned, the little tiny wings that can't fly. And then the whale has a pelvis, yet it doesn't have legs. So why does it need a pelvis? That can connect it to its walking ancestor, right? Sorry, I didn't click these. That darn light. Okay, analogous structures are kind of the opposite as homologous structures. The analogous structures have the same look. On the outside, they look the same. But on the inside, they are not the same. They do not have the same structure. So like the wing of an insect functions the same as the wing of a bird. It allows it to fly, but it does not have the same structure. It doesn't have the humerus, it doesn't have the forearm, it doesn't have the wrist and hand and fingers. So these two would not be related, right? The bat and the bird have the same structures. That would be homologous, and that would show common ancestry. Down here, the wing and the bird, not the same structure, therefore not common ancestry. The same over here. The fin of the shark and the fin of the dolphin are not the same. They look the same, don't they? But the wing of the penguin and the flipper of the dolphin do have the same structures. Isn't that interesting? Ultimately, no matter what you're looking at, you can trace it back to the DNA, right? The DNA codes for who you are. So any trait that we have, we got from our mothers and fathers who got it from their mothers and fathers, and we can keep going back organisms over time, right? So the common ancestors that gave rise to us gave us these genes. And so we can look at relationships in these genes. How many of the DNA nucleotides are the same? That's going to show how closely related two organisms are. Tomorrow, we're going to look at DNA sequences and we're going to try to identify which ones are more closely related. So this is looking at cytochrome C. If you remember, that one is in the electron transport chain of for cellular respiration, and all organisms need energy. So all organisms have that cellular respiration, right? So cytochrome C is one of those proteins that has been highly conserved over time. And we can look at the amino acid sequence to see how closely related organisms are. So like us and the chimpanzee, there are 0 differences between us and the chimpanzee. So we clearly have very closely related relatives because they have the same genetic code. The rhesus monkey, not very different from us, only 1 amino acid different, right? So that is showing you that they are still closely related to us. But if I compared our cytochrome C to yeast, we're very different from a yeast, aren't we? So we can see that we are least like the yeast in this case, and therefore we have a lesser degree of kinship. So we refer to the degree of kinship as how closely related two organisms are. We have a high degree of kinship with the chimp, a low degree of kinship with the yeast. Another example, the hemoglobin molecule carries oxygen. So we can look at the hemoglobin molecules and we'll see that the vertebrates are going to be more closely aligned than are the vertebrate and an invertebrate, right? And if we go through the kingdoms, we can find we are less alike or more alike based on the amino acid sequence that is in our hemoglobin molecule. Again, right here, we're only 1 amino acid different between the gorilla and us, 15 between us and a dog. They're vertebrates, they're mammals, we're closely related. And as I keep going further and further away, those that share less traits than us, right? An amphibian has slimy skin, lives in the water and on land. We have lots of different traits. And so we can see we're less alike them, right? Because the amino acid sequences are more different. So the less differences, the more closely related two organisms are, the more recent their common ancestor. So you should be able to talk about each of those disciplines and how they supply us with evidence for evolution. And you should be able to analyze why they are pieces of evidence of evolution. So this is my little friend Lefty from Rishikesh, India. He only has one arm, but he's surviving. What questions do you have?